What if you were never afraid of judgment itself, but of what it might take from you? What if the fear that shapes your choices, silences your truth, and edits your personality isn't just social anxiety, but a form of invisible obedience? And what if one single shift in thought could dissolve it forever? There's a moment so small you hardly notice it when you walk into a room and something shifts. You sit a little straighter, you adjust your tone, you measure your words, and in that brief space between instinct and action, you abandon something. It's invisible, intangible, but it costs you your presence. We are watched, not by surveillance, cameras or satellites, though those are real enough, but by something deeper, more ancient, and far more invasive. We are watched by imagined eyes, projected judgment, simulated audiences that live inside our own minds. And from them, we seek something that appears innocent, but is anything but approval. At first glance, the fear of judgment seems like a social inconvenience, a source of anxiety at parties, a hesitation before speaking, a nervous smile when someone stares. But beneath the awkward posture and the carefully calculated silence is something darker. Judgment isn't just about embarrassment, it's about power. We don't fear being judged because we think we're wrong. We fear it because judgment has the terrifying ability to define us. Before we can say who we are, it already has. And in a world addicted to applause, silence feels like death. What happens when every decision, every thought, every self-expression must pass through the imagined filter of other people's opinions? What happens when your inner world is no longer your own, but leased out to anyone willing to applaud or condemn? A child doesn't begin life this way. A child sings, dances, speaks without shame. There is no jury, no internal censor. But slowly, through correction, comparison, punishment, and praise, they begin to see themselves from the outside. Not as they are, but as they appear. Not as a subject, but as an object. And once you become an object in your own mind, you become a product in someone else's world. A performance begins. One that never ends. We dress for others. We speak in tones designed to please. We smile when we're aching inside. We laugh at jokes we don't find funny. We wear curated identities like uniforms, refined, polished, algorithmically adjusted. Because deep down something has been installed in us. The belief that to be disliked is to be unworthy, that to be misunderstood is to be invisible, and that unless the world reflects us back in the right light, we do not exist at all. So we chase the applause. We chase it on social media, counting likes like oxygen tanks in a collapsing cave. We chase it in relationships, in careers, in ideologies, begging the world to affirm our image of ourselves. But applause is not the truth. Applause is not love. Applause is not freedom. Applause is control. Because when someone's opinion of you holds the power to shape your self-image, they own a piece of you. And if everyone owns a piece, then you belong to no one, not even yourself. The ancient Romans called it vox populi, the voice of the people, and even they feared it. The same crowds that cheered your rise could celebrate your execution. History is filled with people who were adored until they weren't. We tell ourselves that judgment helps us grow, that it keeps us accountable. But that's a lie whispered by fear. Improvement comes from clarity, not shame. Growth is born of courage, not coercion. Judgment is not feedback, it's leverage. And when you fear it, you become pliable, controllable. Governed not by law, but by perception. The worst kind of prison is the one you decorate, the one you defend, the one you polish until it looks like cess. That is the tyranny of applause. You become afraid to think differently, not because your ideas are wrong, but because they might be unpopular. You hesitate to act, not because the action is immoral, but because someone might disapprove. You avoid your own truth, not because it's unworthy, but because it might cost you a place in the crowd, and the more you chase approval, the more approval you need. It becomes a drug, a loop, a form of spiritual dependency disguised as social connection. But here's the part no one tells you. Approval is never really about you. It's about how well you fit into a story someone else already believes. A mold, a memory, a fantasy. So when they judge you, they are not reacting to who you are, but to who you fail to be for them. Judgment is not about you. It never was. And when you finally understand that, a fracture opens in the wall, a crack in the performance, a rupture in the system you thought was real. Because if judgment doesn't define you, what does? That single question is the beginning of everything. Judgment has always been more than a glance or an opinion. At its core, it is a method of control. And once you understand how deeply this fear has been weaponized throughout history, you'll realize that the very instinct to self-censor isn't personal. It's political. There is a reason you hesitate before speaking. A reason you hold back in conversations. A reason you wonder, what will they think? Long before the words have even formed. That reason has a lineage centuries old. From ancient empires to modern democracies, from religious orders to algorithmic systems, the fear of being judged has been engineered as one of the most efficient forms of governance. It requires no guards, no guns, no chains. Only the whisper that someone, somewhere, might disapprove of who you are. In totalitarian regimes, the architecture of control was built on visibility. The more exposed a citizen was, the more predictable and punishable they became. Surveillance wasn't just about watching. It was about reminding people they could be watched. That at any given moment, a neighbor, a coworker, or even a family member could become a silent observer and then a willing informant. And so, behavior changed not because a law was passed, but because fear became internalized. Michel Foucault called this the panopticon effect, a metaphor born from an 18th century prison design where inmates were potentially always visible to a single guard in a central tower, though they never knew when they were actually being watched. Eventually, the presence of the tower became enough. The prisoner began to regulate himself just in case. He became both subject and guard, judged. And judging. But this wasn't limited to prisons. Societies began to replicate this architecture on a mass scale. Religion took the idea and expanded it into eternity. Not only are your actions seen, but your thoughts, your doubts, your silence. Every impulse could be judged. And judgment didn't end in shame. It could end in exile, or hell. In the medieval world, to be labeled a heretic wasn't merely to be wrong. It was to be untouchable, a social contagion. Even if you escaped physical punishment, your name was blackened. Your existence became a warning. This tactic didn't disappear. It evolved. During the McCarthy era in America, mere suspicion of unorthodox political beliefs was enough to destroy careers. People were blacklisted not for actions, but for affiliations, for whispers, for associations in the past. You didn't need to be a threat, just someone who could be seen as one. What's crucial here is the shift. Punishment was no longer only for what you did. It became about what people thought you might believe. Reputation became territory. And that territory could be seized, colonized, erased. Now ask yourself, how far have we really come? Today, we live in what appears to be a free society. Speech is protected. Ideas are exchanged. Platforms are abundant. But look closer, and you'll see the old architecture redesigned for digital life. The threat is no longer exile from a city. It's deplatforming, career collapse, social erasure. The modern heresy trial takes place on comment threads and search results. You can be judged instantly by strangers, by algorithms, And the punishment is delivered not by a sovereign, but by the mob, or worse, by your own anxious mind, preemptively silencing itself before the world ever has to. This is the brilliance and horror of using judgment as a political tool. You don't need to imprison people when they've already imprisoned themselves. You don't need to burn books if people are too afraid to write them. The fear of judgment becomes self-replicating, viral. Generation to generation, it passes as etiquette, manners, and social intelligence. But strip away the civility, and underneath you'll find obedience, because to fear judgment is to assign your worth to others. It is to outsource your self-definition. And when enough people do that, a society no longer needs force. It becomes auto-regulating, predictable, safe for those in power, and so the illusion is preserved. You're free. As long as you conform just enough. This is where Hannah Arendt's insights become urgent. In The Origins of Totalitarianism, she warns that the danger isn't just the tyrant. It's the citizen who fears stepping out of line, the one who says nothing when the rules tighten, the one who begins to doubt their own thoughts because everyone else seems so certain. Totalitarianism doesn't begin with tanks in the streets. It begins with fear in the mind. And judgment, silent, subtle, constant, is the perfect delivery mechanism. But here's the part they never want you to see. This fear was not born in you. It was installed. You were not born afraid of disapproval. You were taught that social rejection is a kind of death. You were trained to believe that to be judged is to lose everything: love, safety, identity. You learned to trade authenticity for belonging, expression for acceptance, and because everyone else did too. The system sustains itself, but systems can be unlearned. And the moment you see the architecture, the invisible walls, the simulated eyes, the pressure to conform, you begin to notice something else. The space outside of it. You don't need to be fearless, but you do need to be aware. Because once you understand how judgment has been used to control the collective, you begin to question its power over you, and that is where the undoing begins. We often say it, without thinking. What will they think? They'll laugh at me. They won't understand. But who exactly is this they? We carry the fear of being judged, rejected, ridiculed, yet rarely stop to ask, by whom? Who are these invisible people whose imagined disapproval governs so much of what we say, what we wear, how we speak, and even what we dream of becoming? Martin Heidegger had a name for them. He called it das Man, the they. It doesn't refer to a specific group or person. It refers to the anonymous collective, the diffuse, untraceable voice of everyone and no one that shapes behavior without ever revealing its face. It is society's default setting, the unwritten consensus, the force that makes people whisper when they should speak, conform when they should resist, and vanish their individuality in the name of what is normal. They don't shout. It doesn't command. It suggests. It hints. It passively asserts. It is the voice that says, don't be too much. Don't be too different. Just be what's expected. But the power of the isn't that it threatens you. It's that it makes you feel like its judgment is simply the way things are, as if being judged is just part of being seen, as if conformity is the cost of inclusion, and deviation is equivalent to danger. And so, we internalize it. We imagine our coworkers judging us if we speak too boldly. We imagine our family shaming us if we think too freely. We imagine strangers disapproving of our choices, our appearance, our silence, our truth. But none of these people are actually there. We don't know what they think. In many cases, they aren't even thinking of us at all. Still, their shadows remain. And they whisper the same word, don't. We begin to construct our personality like armor, not to protect our essence, but to protect our image. Our goal becomes not to be, but to be acceptable, not to be truthful, but to be safe, not to live authentically, but to be perceived correctly by this imagined tribunal we call they. But here's the secret. They don't exist, not as a unified force, not as a conscious entity, not as a real judge. What we call they is nothing more than a mental collage stitched together from the fragments of past rejections, cultural norms, childhood shaming, media portrayals, and unspoken rules. It's a phantom, a psychological construct formed from the residue of social conditioning. When you fear what they will think, you're often fearing what a teacher once scolded you for, what a parent once disapproved of, what a crowd once laughed at. You're responding not to a real person standing in front of you, but to a memory, to a pattern, to a projection. And projections have no authority unless you believe them. Danger of they is that it becomes a stand-in for your own conscience. It replaces reflection with obedience, inquiry with imitation. It makes you mistake social compliance for moral clarity. But look closer and you'll see they never agree. They is not a singular voice. It's an incoherent chorus. One person tells you to be bold. Another punishes you for standing out. One culture worships rebellion. Another demands obedience. One generation praises self-expression. Another calls it narcissism. So which they are you trying to impress? And at what cost? Because every time you change who you are to fit the unspoken expectations of them, you carve a little piece away from your own truth. You dilute your clarity. You become a reflection of a reflection, a copy of an echo, slowly forgetting the sound of your own voice. That is the psychological violence of the they. It doesn't kill the body. It dissolves the self. But the moment you begin to question it, the spell begins to break. When you ask, who exactly is judging me? And no answer comes back, only vague impressions and cultural noise, you begin to realize that the courtroom you feared was empty all along. The fear of judgment starts to weaken. Not because judgment disappears, but because the illusion of its authority fades. This is where freedom begins. Not in rebellion, not in provocation, but in clarity. The clarity that they is not a God, not a law, not the truth, just a pattern of thought installed over time and subject to your refusal. You were not born fearing their gaze. You were taught to see yourself through borrowed eyes. And you can unlearn it, because when you no longer ask what they will think, you start asking something else. What do I actually know to be true? Who am I when no one is watching, and I no longer care if they are? That's when a new voice begins to emerge, not loud, not defiant, but clear, and yours. And from that voice, everything else becomes possible. There is a moment, quiet, sharp, and unnoticed, when someone looks at you and decides who you are. They judge. Sometimes they say it out loud. Sometimes they don't have to. The glance, the silence, the tone, it all speaks, and it cuts deeper than we admit, because we assume that judgment is a mirror, that it reflects something real about us. That if someone disapproves, it means we've failed. That if we're misunderstood, we've done something wrong. But what if that mirror was broken? What if judgment didn't reveal you, but them? Here's the idea that fractures everything you've been taught to believe. When someone judges you, they are not revealing who you are. They are revealing who they are, their values, their fears, their upbringing, their expectations, their hidden wounds, their unspoken insecurities, their unconscious conditioning. Judgment isn't a window into your soul. It's a projection from this. Baruch Spinoza once wrote that understanding is the opposite of judgment. To understand something is to see it as it is, not through the lens of good or bad, right or wrong, but clearly, fully, and without distortion. Judgment, by contrast, arises when understanding fails. It fills the void with labels. It replaces. Reflection with reaction. And reactions by nature are not about what is. They're about what the mind can tolerate. So when someone calls you arrogant, it might be because they were taught to fear confidence. When someone says you're too quiet, it might be because your silence reminds them of something they're trying to escape. When someone mocks your difference, it might be because they've spent their life terrified of standing out. Judgment is rarely about the judge. It is an autobiography, disguised as a critique, but we don't see that, not at first. Because we're trained, from childhood, to internalize the voices of others, to absorb shame like a sponge, to assume that disapproval is a signal of failure, not an echo of someone else's story, and so we carry their judgment. Like a weight, like a scar, we replay their words in our heads. We shrink in their presence. We become small in our own imagination, not because they were right, but because we never stopped to ask, where is this really coming from? When someone says, you'll never make it, what they often mean is, I never did. When someone tells you, you're too much, what they mean is, I was never allowed to be. When someone tells you, you should be more like them, what they're really saying is, I've forgotten how to be myself. Judgment is a confession, not about your truth, but about their limits. Friedrich Nietzsche saw this clearly. He believed that moral judgments, especially those directed at others, were often weapons of resentment. When people cannot express their own power or creativity, they begin to resent those who can. And that resentment turns into judgment, not as an expression of truth, but as a way to level the playing field, to bring the other down. He called it slave morality, the tendency of the powerless to call powerful people evil, not because they are, but because it justifies their own powerlessness. When someone judges your ambition, it might be because it threatens their passivity. When someone criticizes your freedom, it might be because they're still trapped. When someone mocks your healing, it might be because they haven't started theirs. So why does it still hurt? Because part of us wants their approval. We want to be seen, understood, validated. We want them to say, you're good, because we've been taught that our goodness depends on their agreement. But at DOESN single quotes T. Your worth is not a democracy. It is not up for vote. It cannot be argued into existence or judged out of relevance. The part of you that seeks truth, that speaks honestly, that moves in clarity, that part exists before judgment, beneath it. Beyond it. Understanding this doesn't make you immune to judgment. It makes you free from its authority. You can hear the criticism, and instead of collapsing, you ask, does this reveal anything real about me? Or is this a reflection of their story, their frame, their pain? You stop reacting. You start discerning. This is not arrogance. This is psychological sovereignty. It is the ability to remain intact, not by rejecting all feedback, but by recognizing the source of the voice that speaks. There is a difference between a mirror and a mask. Judgment is often the latter, hiding the judge far more than it reveals the judged. And when you see that clearly, you stop shrinking under the weight of other people's projections. You begin to listen differently, not with fear, but with awareness. Not to seek praise or avoid blame, but to understand what others are truly saying, even when they don't realize it themselves. Sometimes judgment reveals wounds asking to be seen. Sometimes it's a call for help in the language of criticism. And sometimes it's just noise, carrying no meaning except the one you give it. You are not here to be understood by everyone. You are not here to be shaped by every opinion that passes through the air. You are here to know yourself so deeply, so clearly, that even when the world projects its shadows onto you, you do not mistake them for your reflection. Because once you realize that judgment is not about you, you are no longer afraid of it. And when that fear dissolves, what remains is not pride. It's peaceful. The kind of peace that only comes when you stop begging others to tell you who you are, and start remembering it for yourself. To be free is not to be invisible. It is to be seen, misjudged, misunderstood, and remain untouched. There is a kind of human being that no longer seeks permission to be. They move differently, speak calmly when ridiculed, think clearly in the face of pressure, not because they are arrogant, but because they are anchored. Something within them no longer negotiates with the fear of judgment. They are psychologically ungovernable. That word, ungovernable, may sound radical, rebellious, defiant, but its power is subtler. It means this: your inner world can no longer be manipulated through approval or controlled through fear. You no longer live as a mirror for others. You live as yourself. This is not recklessness. It is sovereignty. To reach this state, something must break, not in you, but in the system that once held your self-worth hostage. The system that told you to be small, agreeable, careful, likable. The system that equated your safety with obedience and your value with applause. The psychologically ungovernable don't need to win arguments. They don't need to be seen as correct. They don't need to perform for the crowd, because they no longer depend on the crowd at all. Throughout history, these people have existed like quiet flames in a storm, dissidents, philosophers, whistleblowers, artists, individuals who walked directly into the machinery of judgment and kept walking, not to provoke, but because something in them refused to yield. Consider the case of Hannah Arendt herself. When she published Eichmann in Jerusalem, her reporting on the trial of a Nazi bureaucrat shocked the world, not because of the facts, but because of her conclusion. She did not call Eichmann a monster. She called him ordinary. And that ordinariness, she argued, was far more dangerous. It revealed the banality of evil, the chilling truth that atrocities are often committed not by fanatics, but by obedient people who refuse to think for themselves. The backlash was immediate. Colleagues turned on her, friends cut ties. Critics called her cruel, arrogant, even traitorous. She was judged, dismissed, condemned, but she didn't retract. She didn't explain herself endlessly. She didn't beg for understanding. She stood where she stood, not in stubbornness, but in clarity, because independent thought will always be punished in cultures of conformity, and clarity is often mistaken for coldness in a world addicted to emotional consensus. To become psychologically ungovernable, you must pass through that fire. The fire of being misread, misrepresented, taken out of context, and choose not to be destroyed by it. You must stop living for the fantasy of being understood, because even if people understand you today, they may turn tomorrow. The crowd is not stable. The crowd is not loyal. The crowd is a storm, always shifting, always hungry. So instead of chasing the impossible, universal approval, the ungovernable learn to anchor themselves in something else, something deeper. Not ego, not defiance, but vision. They have chosen to live in truth, even when that truth isolates them, to speak with clarity, even when that clarity invites ridicule, to detach from narratives written by those who need characters, not individuals, and that detachment is not coldness. It's freedom. Nelson Mandela sat in a prison cell for 27 years, not because he was dangerous in a traditional sense, but because he refused to submit to the definitions imposed on him. He knew who he was, and even within stone walls they could not govern his mind. He said, "I am the master of my fate, the captain of my soul." That is not a metaphor. That is a refusal to be defined by judgment, even when judgment has teeth. Or consider whistleblowers who exposed government secrets. knowing their names would be dragged, their motives questioned, their lives altered forever. They weren't fearless. But they acted anyway. Because when your allegiance is to truth, not reputation, judgment becomes irrelevant. The same can be said for artists who challenge the dominant narrative, thinkers who criticize the ideologies of their own time, teachers who speak truths students aren't yet ready to hear. These are not reckless people. They are disciplined, not by the approval of the world, but by the clarity of thought. To become psychologically ungovernable, you must go through a kind of death, not of your body, but of your image. You must let go of the person who exists to be liked, the one who plays small to avoid judgment, the one who edits their soul to stay within the lines. When that version of you dissolves, something astonishing happens. You begin to speak without rehearsing how it will be received. You begin to move without scanning for approval. You begin to think without asking for permission, and your presence changes. You no longer emit the energy of someone waiting for validation. You radiate the calm of someone who already possesses it internally. That calm is unsettling to those still performing, but it is magnetic to those searching for truth. The world cannot control a person who no longer fears disapproval. It can threaten them, mock them, misrepresent them, but it cannot shape them, and that makes them powerful, not over others, but within themselves. This power is not loud. It does not need to be convincing. It simply remains. To be psychologically ungovernable is not to be invincible. It is to be real, fully, deeply, dangerously real in a world that rewards the mask. And once you taste that kind of freedom, you never go back, because no amount of praise can replace the peace of no longer needing it. There is a room in your mind. You've built it over time. A courtroom. Inside, there are seats. A jury, maybe a judge. The faces change. Teachers, family, strangers on the internet, people you once admired. Sometimes the jury is silent. Sometimes it whispers. Other times it screams. And at the center of it all stands you, accused not of crimes, but of being insufficient, too quiet, too loud, too strange, too much, not enough. This is the inner trial, a place where every action is evidence, every silence is suspicious, and every misstep feels like a verdict. You try to present yourself the right way, to argue your case, to be understood, to be found innocent, but no matter how hard you try, the trial never ends, until you realize one simple, shattering thing: you were never on trial. You were simply present. That single thought is the key, not a weapon, not a shield, but a dissolution. Courtroom only existed because you believed it did. The jurors only mattered because you appointed them. The trial only had power because you thought you needed to win it. But what if there is nothing to win? The moment you release the belief that you must be perceived correctly, something extraordinary happens. The room falls silent. The seats vanish. The air becomes still. And in that stillness, you meet yourself, not as an image to defend, but as a presence to experience. This is not apathy. It's not detachment in the cold sense. It is clear. The Stoics knew this well. Epictetus taught that we suffer not from events, but from our judgments about them. That fear comes not from what people think, but from the meaning we assign to their thinking. And that meaning is optional. In Buddhism, there is a similar idea, that the self we defend, the one constantly edited, improved, justified, is not a fixed entity. It's a passing construction, a narrative, a bundle of sensations and fears clinging to impermanence. And when we cling, we suffer. But when we let go, not of life, but of illusion, we begin to see that you were never meant to carry the weight of other people's interpretations. Their thoughts are clouds, their opinions are echoes. They are not mirrors, they are weather, passing through, and when you stop trying to control the forecast, you start living in the sky. Presence is not passive, it's radical. To stand in yourself, unedited, to act, to speak, to exist, without measuring every moment against how it might be received, that is not weakness. That is strength. Imagine waking up tomorrow with this truth fully internalized. You are not here to be understood. You are here to understand. You are not here to perform. You are here to be. You are not here to win the trial. You are here to dissolve the courtroom, and in that dissolution, peace. Not the peace that comes from being liked, but the kind that comes from no longer needing to be. The inner trial ends not with a verdict, but with an awakening. You look around. There is no judge, no jury, just you. Alive, present, free. What happens when the fear of judgment no longer defines you? What kind of life begins when your behavior is no longer shaped by imagined eyes? Watching, measuring, dissecting? It's easy to imagine that without fear, we become wild. That without shame, we descend into chaos. That if no one's opinion mattered, we'd unravel. But that's a myth, one rooted in control, not truth. The reality is quieter and more beautiful. When judgment no longer commands your attention, what takes its place is not recklessness, but simplicity. A return to something you haven't felt since childhood, the ability to just be, not perform, not perfect. Just be. No longer asking, what will they think? But instead, what is true for me in this moment? In that question, a shift occurs. Your attention moves from the outer world to the inner, from performance to presence, from survival to sincerity. You begin to act not as a reaction to others, but as an expression of awareness. Not to be liked, but to be real. Not to impress, but to live without pretense. And strangely, it doesn't push people away. It draws them in, because authenticity is magnetic. Not because it promises perfection, but because it offers permission. When you are no longer afraid to be misunderstood, others begin to wonder why they still are. When you no longer chase validation, others begin to question why they ever needed it. You become a mirror, not of society, but of stillness. And in that stillness, something sacred is remembered. But this doesn't mean you escape judgment entirely. People will still misread you, mislabel you. Some will call your peace arrogance. Others will call your clarity cold. But it won't land the same way it once did. Because you know now, they're not seeing you. They're seeing their own projections. And you no longer exist to fix those mirrors, you let them reflect what they must. And you keep walking. This is not detachment from life. It's immersion in life without the need to control the storyline. You begin to participate more fully, not because you want to impress the world, but because you've stopped asking for its permission. Your speech becomes direct, not harsh, just unfiltered. Your choices become deliberate, not performative, just aligned. Your silence becomes nourishing, not passive. Just clear. And the endless mental noise, the rehearsing, the rewinding, the editing of your own existence, it fades. Because you're no longer living in a theater. You're living in reality. This is what freedom looks like. Not fireworks, but space. Not rebellion, but return. To the self that existed before the world told you who to be. You begin to see how much of your life was lived trying to prove something. To be good enough, smart enough, successful enough. To earn the invisible nod of approval from people who never truly knew you. And when you drop that burden, you feel the weight you've been carrying. It wasn't yours to begin with. It was inherited, installed, learned. And now, unlearn it. You look around and the world still spins. People still judge, still misunderstand, still play the roles they've always played, but something fundamental has changed. They no longer govern your sense of self, because once you no longer need to be seen a certain way, you become something rarer than loved. You become free. This is not a final destination. There will be moments of doubt, moments where the old fears resurface. But they are no longer your compass. You've remembered something deeper than approval, something quieter than pride, something more stable than applause. Your life is no longer an argument. It is a presence, and the more you live from that space, the more you realize it's not that the world stopped judging. It's that you stopped listening to voices that don't understand what you're becoming. What you're becoming is not an idea, not a role, not a brand. You're becoming real, present, unfinished, free. And for the first time, unknown. Not in the sense of forgotten, but in the sense of uncontained. You are no longer trapped in the image others created of you. You are no longer a prisoner of projection. You've stepped outside the mirror, outside the courtroom, outside the game. And now, you simply are. There's no need to be understood, no need to be praised, no need to be protected by pretense, because you've seen through the illusion, and you've returned to the truth. The fear of judgment dies the moment you realize no one sees the truth, only reflections. And you are no longer afraid to be unknown. Stillness, silence, peace.